My name is Alastair Scott. I am the Executive Director of the Global Rewilding Alliance, and it is my huge pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, this special webinar on working with private landowners on rewilding and nature recovery. We are incredibly lucky today to have four leading experts from around the world. Firstly, we have Dr. Jennifer Gooden, who is President and Chief Exec of the Biophilia Foundation. Jennifer, that's you waving. Yes, great. So Jennifer is going to start us off with a 20-minute TED-style talk, which draws on social psychology theory of people's motivations for getting involved in nature recovery. And then we have three expert panelists who are going to respond to what Jennifer has said. First of all, Rachel Lowry. Rachel is the chief exec of Bush Heritage in Australia. And there you are, there's Rachel, who is incredibly generously staying up till 1 a.m. to be with us. That's amazing of you, Rachel. Secondly, Daniel Kinka is Director of Rewilding at American Prairie, I believe mainly in Montana. There's Daniel. Amazing, huge landscape scale restoration of the grasslands in Montana, reintroducing bison and all sorts of amazing creatures. And I believe you recently had a brown bear found its way to your patch of land, all on its own. So nature is incredible at rebounding if we only let her have a chance. And then thirdly, Alastair Driver, who until recently, there we are, there's Alastair with a thumbs up, and has been one of the directors of Rewilding Britain. I believe, Alastair, you were the third employee of Rewilding Britain, and when you left 8 years later, there were 33 employees. So you've been there for this huge growth period, and you've been working with lots and lots of landowners, some of them substantial, welcoming them to the world of rewilding and advising them on how to bring nature back onto their land. So we have this amazing panel. That's enough, quite enough from me. Without further ado, over to you, Jennifer.
Okay, thank you. Let me just share my slides. Okay.
That's great.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that nice welcome. It's always a delight to collaborate with a fantastic team of the Global Rewilding Alliance, and excited to be here today to talk about the application of social science to engaging landowners in rewilding. As Alastair said, I'm with the Biophilia Foundation. I'm based in Colorado in the US, and Biophilia is grant-making funds conservation, wildlife, and restoration projects in the US and in northern Mexico with an emphasis on private land. Years ago, when I first became interested in rewilding, I found myself at the gate of a rewilding project in Scotland, looking at the difference that a fence line could make, like the land around it. This property had once been really heavily browsed by deer and had been browsed down to just a thin carpet of grass under some tall, mature pines. But after this rewilding project started, it was now alive. There was bird song, there were insects, there were signs of natural regeneration everywhere. And it wasn't a government or an NGO restoration project, it was privately owned land that had been rewilded by choice and not by mandate. And for me, that moment changed how I thought about conservation, because perhaps like others, I had carried some quiet assumptions that governments and nonprofits protect nature, and that private landowners need to be regulated or even paid to care. But those assumptions proved to be incorrect. We're living at a time now when rewilding has captured the imaginations of people around the world. It's bold and it's hopeful, and it gives us a chance to trust ecological processes and to imagine the return of what's been lost. At the same time, we're facing a difficult truth that conservation on public lands is getting harder to do. It will be no surprise to anyone that in the United States, federal funding for conservation has been dramatically reduced. There's a push to sell off some federal lands, and agencies that once led the charge are being defunded or sidelined. And it's not just a US phenomenon. Political winds around the world are shifting, and that puts pressure on budgets, on protections, and on biodiversity frameworks. So there's one more reason that if we want to rewild at scale, the best opportunities may be on private land. And yet, despite that, our approach to landowners often lags behind. It's not unusual to see outreach programs that treat landowners as an obstacle or as someone that we need to educate, monitor, incentivize, or otherwise influence. Sometimes that's subtle. It might be embedded in the way that we design policy or write grant applications. And sometimes it's more explicit, where motives may actually be an object of suspicion. And I first became interested in this tension when I was doing a rewilding project many years ago in the UK and the Netherlands, working on rewilding policy. I visited sites that were run by governments, nonprofits, and by private landowners. And up until that time, my entire career had been spent in the nonprofit sector and a little bit in government. And so I just really expected to be most inspired by those kind of projects. And no doubt they were truly inspiring. But what surprised me is that the sites that felt most energetic were the ones that were being rewilded by private landowners who wanted to try new things and move really quickly. And from there, I got back to my desk, went back to the scholarly literature on private land conservation, and I found this disconnect. And much of that academic scholarship I reviewed described landowners as self-interested, opportunistic, even exploitative. Here were some themes I found here. I read about exclusion, accumulation of wealth, perpetuation of inequality, even green grabbing. And no doubt these were really important critiques of power as they play out in the world of conservation, but they didn't match the perspectives that I was hearing in the field from the people who were doing the rewilding. These were people who saw conservation as a meaningful way to impact the world, and they weren't doing it for a tax break. They were doing it because they wanted to leave something wild behind. And everything I saw there pointed to intrinsic motivation. So I'm going to start here with a quick grounding in the psychology of motivation. The motivation is what gets us to act. It can come from many sources. It can be economic, social, emotional, biological, and it often operates below the surface of conscious awareness. Motivation is closely related to goals, but you can think about a goal as what you want and motivation as why you act. And while motivations are often tangled and overlapping, one of the most important distinctions that we can make is this. Is the motivation coming from within or is it coming from the outside? And we call those intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation is when you do something because you find it meaningful and satisfying. Whereas extrinsic motivation is when you do something because of a reward or to avoid a punishment. So I can give you a couple examples. A landowner starts letting pasture regenerate because she remembers birds nesting there as a child and she wants to see them return. Another landowner increases the size of a riparian buffer because he's approached by the municipality with a financial incentive. Now, both of these are conservation wins, but only one of them is likely to persist in the absence of an incentive. Okay, now why does this matter? First, it matters because the two types of motivation affect behavior differently. As the example allude to, intrinsic motivation is more durable. When an action is driven by one's own sense of meaning or satisfaction, it's more connected to identity, and it's therefore more likely to last. And the second reason that this distinction matters is that intrinsic and extrinsic motivations can interact with each other, and sometimes in counterintuitive ways. One of the early topics of interest in this field when it got started in the 1970s was kids' behavior and specifically reading. And it was a bit of a puzzle. Young kids love to read, they love books, and then they go to school and suddenly stop enjoying reading. And why did school make them dislike something that they previously liked to do for its own sake? You may have heard of B.F. Skinner, a famous mid-century psychologist. And he studied something called operant behavior, which showed that if you gave a person, or more commonly an animal, a reward, it would increase the frequency of the behavior for which you gave the reward. So like you give a rat a food pellet for pressing a lever and it will just keep pressing the lever and that kind of thing. And it was thought at that time that motivations were additive. So if there's something a person really loved to do, like reading, and you paid them to do it, they ought to do it even more. But research then showed that when you asked people to do enjoyable things, like reading or playing a game, and then you paid them to do it, it actually decreased that person's intrinsic motivation to perform the activity. And even if you just allowed someone to do something fun, they get to read their book or play their game, but you restrict how they do it, then that can also decrease intrinsic motivation. So I have an illustration here of how this might work in conservation. And what I'm showing here in a green block, let's call this 1 unit of intrinsic motivation. It's got a tree, so it's intrinsic motivation to protect nature. And the idea is this person has an M1 level of motivation now, and we want them to be more motivated and to produce more conservation behavior. And so we think that we might add a financial incentive in order to get them to do more. So we add the financial incentive here, and we might expect, if motivations add together, that we would now have this higher M2 level of motivation. But when you get this effect, then what you might actually see is the intrinsic motivation being crushed, or in behavioral economics, you might hear this referred to as eroded or crowding out of motivations. And you don't actually end up with as much motivation as you thought you were going to. You might end up with M2 level of motivation. M2 is still higher than M1. So this may be an okay situation if that financial incentive is going to stay there. But the risk comes if the financial incentive is removed. And now you're in a position where you may be worse off than you were previously because the intrinsic motivation has been pushed. Another way to look at this is the over-justification effect. So this shows a bit how it plays out over time. So I have here 2 charts. On the horizontal axis, we're looking at time, and on the top, we're looking at amount of motivation, and on the bottom, the amount of behavior. So let's start out with a baseline. This is a landowner we're imagining who has a high level of intrinsic motivation. So you can see their line at the top, and currently no situation where there's any kind of incentive or reward or punishment, so almost no extrinsic motivation. And in the behavior chart, you can see they just have a moderate amount of their conservation behavior. Now we introduce a reward to the situation. And what the over-justification effect tells us is that once we introduce that reward, their extrinsic motivation to act increases, and correspondingly, their intrinsic motivation may decrease. That extrinsic motivation, perhaps it's something the landowner really wanted, and the behavior increases. And then now, if later the reward is terminated, what you'll then see, extrinsic motivation goes away. If the intrinsic motivation doesn't bounce back, the risk is that behavior declines to a lower level than it was previously. So when a landowner's already motivated, when they're rewilding out of love or legacy, we should do everything we can to support that motivation and to let their energy drive the work. But we risk inadvertently undermining it when we add incentives to something that already really matters to them. So instead of reinforcing their ownership, we start replacing it, and they stop doing it for themselves, and they start doing it for money or for us, or maybe not even at all. So that brings us to our first takeaway. I have 3 takeaways today. The first one is don't crush intrinsic motivation. It's a really valuable thing, and we want to, if we find that in a landowner, we want to preserve that and to support it. Okay, so we know that intrinsic motivation is more durable and therefore desirable. But if intrinsic motivation comes from within a person, then by definition, I can't create it in another person. There's really not much I can do to create it. So what can I do? You can think of intrinsic motivation like a seed. So there's no amount of reward or punishment that you can give a seed that will entice it to sprout. You can't yell a seed into sprouting. It's only what's inside the seed that will make it sprout or not. But what we can do are provide the conditions that will help it flourish. We can provide the right amount of sunlight, the right amount of water, or good soil for that particular plant. Or we can provide conditions that kill that seed, that keep it from ever sprouting. And that's really the extent of our power. For the intrinsic motivation, self-determination theory gives us a really powerful framework here. So it identifies three core needs that must be met for intrinsic motivation to flourish. The first is autonomy. You can think of this as self-direction, or the sense, I choose this. The second is competence, which you might think of as skills, like either developing new skills or getting to use skills that you already have. And that's the sense, I can do this. And then finally, relatedness, just connection, and the sense that this connects me to something bigger. The self-determination theory explains that all humans have these fundamental psychological needs. And what I think is really remarkable about this theory, or more accurately, a meta theory, is how well it's been studied. I mean, 50 years of research on this, and it's been validated across different domains, from work environments, schools, sports, families, biodiversity conservation. It's also been tested across a lot of different cultures: United States, Australia, Belgium, Mexico, Peru, Philippines, China. And it's been tested across ages and socioeconomic levels. And what it tells us is that satisfaction of these needs provides the conditions for intrinsic motivation to flourish. And conversely, if we use external rewards or external punishments that undermine a person's sense of autonomy, competence, or relatedness, for example, if they're perceived by the person as being controlling, that will reduce intrinsic motivation toward the activity. That brings us to our second takeaway, which is nourish that seed. Again, if that intrinsic motivation is valuable, then the things we want to be doing to help foster it are making sure that we're allowing the person with the motivation to have that sense of autonomy, express competence, and feel connected. So you may be thinking, like, wait, plenty of conservation projects on private land start out as a result of money or peer pressure or regulation. I think it's unrealistic to expect landowners to start out as intrinsically motivated. And I would agree that is true. Some, maybe many landowners are going to need a nudge to get going. And to understand this, we need to dive a little bit deeper into extrinsic motivation, because there are actually different types of extrinsic motivation, some of which feel very external, and some of which actually start to become internalized and feel more like intrinsic motivation. So you can think about extrinsic motivation, and again, we're talking about these things that come from the outside, as a continuum that varies in degree. So these are actually 4 different categories. The names are not that important, but let's start over on the right side in the light colored bar. Here you would have external regulation. These are literal rewards and punishment, where the motivation is clearly coming from the outside. And obvious examples here are financial incentives or fines. As you move to the right, you get to interjection, which is something more akin to social pressure or external pressure. So you might think about this being praise or guilt or shame. And then there's a bit of a shift where we come to identification. And at this level of motivation, or at this level of internalization, a person identifies with the aims, and they see them as personally important and resonant with their own values. So it still feels like it's outside, but it really aligns with who they are. And then finally, we have integration, where the motivation initially starts out as external, but it becomes so congruent with a person's values and behavior that it becomes internally driven. So an example here might be a volunteer who joins one of our field programs just to hang out with their friends, but then they end up taking on the cause as their own. And there are different conditions that affect where on that continuum a person's motivation lies. And what's really great about that is that these are the 3 factors are the same things that foster intrinsic motivation. They are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So the big takeaway here is that treating landowners in a way that really allows them to express those things, that's important whether or not they're intrinsically motivated or extrinsically motivated. So take a farmer who agrees to rewild part of his property as part of let's say, a government program. And at first, he's motivated by the money. But over time, he sees the land change. Maybe he learns to identify the native grass species that return. He starts watching the birds over morning coffee, and his kids start naming the deer. Now it begins to feel meaningful. And eventually, he's going to continue this practice even when the funding ends. And the difference is that he's internalized the motivation and he now feels like it's his. So if we support these three fundamental psychological needs, landowners are more likely to internalize that conservation motivation. Even if it wasn't initially their idea, then it becomes theirs. So that's my takeaway 3, aim to internalize. Much of this operates below the conscious level. And if you asked somebody in an interview or a survey what motivated them, it's highly unlikely they would say autonomy or expressing competence. But research shows that these 3 factors do play an important role in our actions. And I think an implication is that if we want to rewild at scale, we need to rethink some common tools that we use in conservation and rewilding. Landowner education needs to feel more like collaboration than correction. Financial incentives need to be designed with caution and care. And behavior change programs should fundamentally respect identity and autonomy. Maybe the easiest takeaway to remember is that we just need to start maybe with a different question, not just what do we want them to do, but what matters to them. The rewilding asked us to let go and create space for wildness to return. And on private land, that means creating space for people to lead too. So private landowners essential to conservation, and our job is to help them achieve their rewilding goals, not as implementers of our vision, but as stewards of their own vision. So I'm really excited today to hear about how this may play out on the landscape with the 3 seasoned professionals who are joining us, and who all of whom have experience working with private landowners, and interested to see how this framework might apply in their context. Again, I'm Jennifer Gooden. Here's my contact information. You can find me at Biophilia Foundation. My email address is here, and I'd be happy to continue this conversation with anybody who is interested in talking more about engaging landowners. And then just for a second, I'll leave up this slide in case anybody wants a screenshot for some further reading.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I can confirm that Jennifer is an extremely generous person with her time and has been incredibly helpful to us at the Global Rewilding Alliance. So thank you, Jennifer, for setting us up so beautifully with this theory born out of, as you say, a lot of experience in different cultures and different sectors and so on. I loved it when I listened to your other hour-long webinar. I love this 3-part autonomy, competence, relatedness, and I was reflecting on these three words, these 3 ideas, as an explainer for why so many amazing people are getting involved in our movement, often in a completely voluntary capacity. And then I was thinking about the Global Rewilding Alliance team, which is now 15 incredible people around the world, many of whom are purely voluntary. And I do believe that there's so much wisdom in these 3 words. If we reflect on that intrinsic motivation, why are so many millions of people responding to this visceral drive that says enough is enough, we cannot see any more of nature's decline, we're rising up and helping her to recover and come back. So I just absolutely love this framework. It's got such simplicity but richness, and I'd be very interested to hear responses from our 3 locutors, responders. So who would like to go first? Rachel, would you like to go first?
I think I'll be more coherent if I go first, because it's only going to get later and later here in Australia. Good call. Good call. Well, thank you, Jennifer. I think a lot of that certainly rang true for me, and it was so nice to hear it put forward with so much clarity. I can think of a whole range of examples, but what I'll do is quickly explain the context I work in here in Australia at Bush Heritage Australia, and I might give an example of an intrinsic project that I'm seeing work really well, but also an extrinsic one, because I think it's interesting, and I'll be very quick across both. For those that don't know Bush Heritage Australia, we're 34 years old now. Originally, our tagline used to be, "We don't beat around the bush, we buy it." And that was because the idea of Bush Heritage is to really try to step in and protect intact habitat before it's been cleared, before it's been demolished, and particularly in areas where the bioregions are under threat, underrepresented in our reserve system. So if they're lost forever. And one way to get in there is just to own it and to have that autonomy ourselves of being able to care for it. Now, fast forward 34 years, we own 45 different reserves right around Australia, over 1.45 million hectares. But at some point during our journey, we went, you can't buy every important patch that's under threat. And if we're really going to be effective, we have to partner. We have to partner to get scale. And connectivity is a big part of our vision and what we aim to achieve. So if we have a reserve, for example, that's located near a big national park, we'll aim to work with private landowners that sit between us and that national park and see if we can get connectivity going. And in Australia, over 56% of land is owned by farmers. So to achieve that connectivity at scale, we have to work with farmers. And I will therefore share two quick examples that I think speak to the theory that you're putting forward. One is, I don't know if people have ever heard of a vision called Gondwana Link. It resides in Western Australia in a global biodiversity hotspot within Australia. Picture a national park at the top, a national park at the bottom, and a whole heap of cleared landscape for cropping, etc. Many years ago, decades ago in fact, a small number of private landowners actually had this vision: what if we all started to slowly reconnect these national parks and create a habitat corridor for a whole range of threatened species that have global significance based on just the level of species richness in this area and the biodiversity. Now, you talk about intrinsic motivation, and you talked about some people being in it for the love and the legacy. What I've seen in this landscape is the patience over time. You've now got, Bush Heritage, we've purchased a number of, over the last decade and a half, we've been really patient, and when a parcel of land comes up, we'll purchase, and then we'll purchase. Other environmental organisations have purchased, but equally, a number of farmers have really gotten involved. And when I sit down and I speak to these farmers about why they've stayed the course and why they're excited at waiting for that next patch and finding a way to either get it purchased or to influence other farmers in the landscape to get involved, it's because they're a part of something bigger than themselves, and they feel that significance, they feel the legacy that they're part of. And I think that the intrinsic motivations are so baked into the involvement and driving the farmers towards that vision that is bigger than themselves. So I think that's probably a good example. If people want to see some of the incredible results there, we purchased a property just 7 years ago. We've planted over 150 different flora species, and we've had almost every single threatened species return, bar one. So you talk about build it and they will come. That's Bread Mort, and it's one you could look up online. Quick one on extrinsic, though. I think your point is very valid, and you've got to be really careful with it. About 14 years ago, though, our backs were up against the wall in Tasmania. The grasslands in Tasmania, particularly around the Midlands, there's 95% of it has been lost. We're down to the last 5%, and waiting for landowners that have enough intrinsic motivation that are all linked together to give us the scale that was required to protect and restore. The patch was just not deemed to be feasible. And so a number of philanthropists put money into a fund and that fund is invested each year, and there are returns. And now we have what's called the Midlands Conservation Partnership, where we pay stewardship payments. We basically pay farmers not to clear the grassland and to undertake management actions that are informed by an ecologist in the area. And if they undertake those management actions and get that restoration work and all the work, the feral control, the fencing, you name it, done, then they get the full payment at the end of the year. Now, I would say, Jennifer, that some of those farmers in that area are certainly intrinsically motivated, but I would say some are also going, what, you mean I can get thousands of dollars for not doing anything on that patch? Where I think it's been de-risked within your model is because the fund, it's not flash in the pan grant. It is set up and there is an investment company driving the investments. So it's the returns that get shared. It's probably de-risked because it's unlikely ever that fund is going to go bust. I suppose there are some global economic downturns, things like that could wreak havoc. But we've just had a 10-year longitudinal study done through peer-reviewed science that shows that the grasslands are benefiting from those farmers that are involved and that have been receiving those stewardship payments. So again, I would argue probably an extrinsically motivated theory of change, but still yielding results because the times were quite desperate ones, and getting that mosaic to the scale in the landscape from intrinsically motivated stakeholders just wasn't seen as feasible. I'll pause there because I'm so keen to hear from the others, but I think there are just some case studies if people wanted to take a look that are well published on the web as well.
That's absolutely fabulous. Thank you, Rachel. And it's wonderful to hear about your work. As you said just before we went on air, sometimes in Australia you can feel a little bit isolated from other things going on. And it's just amazing to hear the scale that you're working at, 1.45 million hectares. It's sort of scarcely believable and just wonderful. And I love that thing at the end about your long-term vision, so that the extrinsic motivation, the farmers, the landowners are hooked into the governance of that, and therefore it's sustainable and doesn't have this crushing effect that Jennifer was talking about. Thank you so much. So Daniel, would you like to go next? Daniel Kinka from American Prairie.
Happy to. Thank you. Jennifer, excellent presentation. Thank you so much for that. I look forward to the recording and being able to share that with some of my staff. Super relevant. Alastair, Global Rewilding Alliance team, thank you very much for having me. As Alastair mentioned, I'm Daniel. I'm the Director of Rewilding at American Prairie. Just as a very brief primer, American Prairie, similar to Bush Heritage, identified a region in the northern Great Plains, in this case in Montana, that is surprisingly intact for grasslands in North America, which is rare and happens only in the drier parts of the grasslands. It says this habitat still remains largely intact. It's just the wildlife that's been removed. And so our goal very simply was to say, if we were to accumulate something like 3.2 million acres, 1.3 million hectares, that would be the minimum necessary for a fully functioning prairie ecosystem that would contain all of its relevant species, particularly those that have the largest home range requirements, things like bison, things like wolves, things like grizzly bears or brown bears, which are all returning. We're about halfway to that goal right now. We don't have that land base assembled yet. We're about halfway there if we include a national wildlife refuge that's nearby. In Jennifer's framework, American Prairie is the private landowner in this case, but one that explicitly exists to do rewilding. And I think it is true that most of our supporters, our board members, our staff are all motivated intrinsically by the desire to contribute to something that's bigger than they are. It's not a problem that we have as much in terms of motivation, because I think everybody that works for us or supports us is very much on board with this idea of rewilding. Where I think these theories become very relevant to us, and again, this is similar to, I think, what you're facing in Australia, and I assume most protected areas, private protected areas around the world, is this idea that we need, even at 3.2 million acres, 1.3 million hectares, we're talking about 1.5 Yellowstones here, a massive, massive area. You're going to have border effect, boundary effects, if you don't have soft boundaries of tolerance around that protected area. So no matter how big American Prairie gets, if there's just a fence, literally or figuratively, and on the other side of that is agricultural land, cattle production land, with historically low tolerance for wildlife, then you're going to have less wildlife, less biodiversity within your protected area. So for a long time, American Prairie, through multiple outreach arms, things that we call Wild Sky, other community engagement projects, programs, have been working to say, like, how can we make that tolerance buffer around the eventual American prairie so that we're not de-wilding around the edges. We actually have the full complement of biodiversity, of wildness, of wildlife abundance within the protected area. And the primary way that we've done that historically is through financial incentives for landowners, private landowners, almost always in our case, cattle producers, working ranchers in central Montana, by saying, we will provide financial incentives in a way where we will pay essentially, this isn't compensation. There's a lot of compensation programs in Montana, in North America. We don't feel like we're not against that, but we don't feel like we need to add to that. The idea and where we felt that there wasn't really anybody acting in the region in the time was to say that wildlife comes with a value, particularly when it's not causing any problems, not just as a way of compensating for loss or, lost productivity, something like that. So a lot of our programs focus around just, well, can we essentially pay rent for wildlife on these private working lands? In North America, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the wildlife are considered a public trust. They belong to everybody in the United States in this case, or the citizens of the state of Montana. They're managed for us by the trustees in the form of a state agency. So it is public wildlife that is existing and in many cases being supported by the existence of that private land. Under that model, the private landowner is rarely, if ever, compensated for the habitat they provide for the public's wildlife. So American Prairie's approach has been to say that does have a value to us as an NGO, as a nonprofit whose explicit goal is rewilding, but it also comes at a value to the rest of the residents of Montana, to the rest of the residents of the United States, and to some extent globally. These wildlife provide value to the people that live around it, and in many cases, the people that don't live anywhere near it, but you are supporting that, sometimes at your own expense. So we provide those financial incentives, but we are keenly aware of the idea of everything that Jennifer said, right? Which is you can provide these extrinsic motivations, particularly financial incentives, but if that were to ever go away, do those conservation practices persist? And most scary, to Jennifer's points, right, is that like maybe it actually goes below the kind of like the pre-incentive level. And so I think our approach to kind of assuage that is to provide somewhat nominal support. These are not like big, huge cash incentives, but to the point of intrinsic motivation, I've never come across a rancher in the area, the people that we work with is in this program, and many are early adopters. So you can say that they're a bit more on the tail end of the bell curve in terms of attitudes towards wildlife and willingness to take on kind of like novel or progressive ideas around land tenure. But that notwithstanding, I've never met a rancher that didn't like wildlife. I think the feeling is that it's just like it's fine if I like seeing elk or pronghorn or something else move from my property, but that doesn't pay the bills. And increasingly, as ranching becomes a less and less lucrative business for some of these single family small land operators, the financial incentives are very much to do non-conservation minded practices. That doesn't change the fact that they hold these intrinsic motivations to begin with. And so what we're trying to do with our extrinsic motivations in terms of financial incentives is kind of bridge the gap, provide them a little breathing room, remove some of the stress that might be there. Say, hey, let's try this. You've been told a story for a long time that a wilder world is incompatible or maybe less profitable. And from a ranching perspective, let us maybe make up the difference or some of that difference long enough for you to see what that connects to. And in terms of this idea of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, increasingly now, and this is a bit newer, this Wild Sky program has been around for about 10 years, but increasingly now we're making more and more customizable contracts so that the landowner remains as much autonomy as possible. And we are deferring to their competence. We're not really prescribing how they do things. We're just saying, like, we just want to incentivize wildlife tolerance. You probably have the good ideas of what it means to work productively in wilder lands, and we will defer to you in those cases. But also this idea, which I think is increasingly important, and these are ideas that largely have come back from some of our international rewilding partners, particularly the former Tompkins Conservation Project's Rewilding Argentina, I think is an excellent model of doing this work, but connecting to cultural resonance, right? This idea that like the cultural importance for wildlife, wild or ranching lands can date back to kind of a cowboy era. This idea of like a frontier. This is problematic in some respects, but this is to a large extent still the culture of the region. So if we can say, let us bridge the gap and allow you to essentially see what it would have meant, see what it feels like to be to be a cowboy in the historic sense, in the terms of like the 1870s rather than 2025, by living and interacting with wildlife. This is what your predecessors did. This is what your ancestors, to some extent, recently did. And what persists today is the kind of cultural mythology around what it means to be a cowboy, what it means to live on the frontier. Our model says basically, well, you don't have a frontier. Like the cowboy can't exist outside of the frontier, and the frontier cannot exist without its wildlife. So let us provide some financial incentives temporarily, or not temporarily, but in a nominal capacity to allow you to maybe realize that vision of a wilder frontier and allow you the autonomy and the space to say, how does this work? How can I be a productive cattleman, cattlewoman, producer in these landscapes, and potentially also take advantage of those wilder aspects of the land that I steward, whether it's through wildlife tourism or other side businesses that would bring in revenue associated with the wildness of the property, not just its production value.
That's so interesting. Daniel, thank you so much. It's very interesting to hear you as well grappling with this question of extrinsic motivations and this keen awareness of what Jennifer has shared with us, and the need not only not to crush the intrinsic motivation, but also to harness these things around autonomy and competence and identity and so on. So our final responder is Professor Alastair Driver, who I think in my introduction I forgot to say very proudly that Alastair has recently become a senior advisor to the Global Rewilding Alliance. An absolutely wonderful moment for us. So Alastair, welcome. It's your first public event with that, at least GRA webinar with that title. So welcome. We're delighted to have you.
Great, thanks, Alastair. Well, great to see you, everybody. I'll just give you a quick resume of my experience over the last 10 years, and you will see that it's very much focused on a particular type of rewilding in this in the UK. So I've been traveling the country advising landowners, both on behalf of Rewilding Britain and in a private capacity now, and in that capacity, I will talk literally to anyone who wants to have a conversation, whether they be a...
Oh no, we've lost Alastair.
Environmental NGO, anybody really who is prepared to have a conversation about managing the land for nature recovery at scale. And in the course of that work, which I'm now doing in a private capacity, I'm coming across about a quarter of these landowners as mainly private estates, large private estates. Now, these are people with money to start with. They certainly have very significant assets. They don't always have much cash, but they certainly have large properties, large in UK terms. And so I am dealing with a particular type of private landowner in the main, and that is one that has enough land to hedge their bets, if you like, on how they manage that land. So what I'm finding is that they're not rewilding their entire land holding, they're rewilding the least productive bits of it. But I've always in that capacity only really ever encountered people so far with this intrinsic motivation. And when I spoke to Jen last week in a preparatory meeting, and again hearing her today, it's very much made me think I need to keep an eye open for this possible change that might happen to a more extrinsically motivated situation if and when people start to become totally reliant on government subsidies, for example, stewardship, etc. But at the moment, the situation is very much that these people, and I'll cite this example where I am actually at the moment. So this week I'm working at a place that I've privately advised for 5 years now, was intensive sheep grazing, billiard table sheep graze fields everywhere, and covering about 1,000 hectares of land, and we're essentially rewilding half of it. Now, that's quite large in UK terms for a rewilding project, but obviously pathetically small when we talk Australia and USA. But nevertheless, it's very significant in terms of its potential impact on biodiversity and indeed on people human well-being, etc., and all the various ecosystem services we know about. But this place, I'll give you this example. It's a slightly extreme example in terms of longevity of ownership, but this landowner and his family have owned this land for 1,050 years. He is the 32nd generation on this land. And he has decided that it's time for a change. I came to see him 5 years ago, and he was ready to talk about change, to move from intensive, very intensive sheep grazing, which was, he could see, significantly reducing the nature value of that land, turning it into a monoculture, and it had done for decades. That's what he grew up with. And it was right post-war in this country that we focus very much on food production and trying to produce food from land that really wasn't fit for farming. He's made that change on half his land, and he's kept the other half as either nature-friendly farming, or in some cases there are tenancy arrangements that you can't change, so it's still very intensive farming. But what motivated him was the fact that he had a young daughter who was going to grow up and inherit this land. And he just felt that what he was seeing out there simply was not good enough to hand over to the next generation. And that, I have found that situation to be pretty much the norm for when I'm dealing with private landowners so far. And I've dealt with, a couple of hundred sites now in this country. I've advised, I've nearly advised close to 250,000 acres of land. And that has been the consistent approach. But I think part of the reason why 5 years on, in fact, nearly 10 years on from some of the first sites I've advised, I still think these people are still driven by intrinsic motivation, is because they are still seeing on a daily basis amazing wildlife appear on their land. They are, every single week that passes, when I come to Broughton, this site I'm on now, there's always something new to see. There's always more of something, or a new bird species has started breeding, or somebody's witnessed some kind of interaction between species that they've never seen before on the trail cams. I think that is what is continuing to drive people on. But what Jen has made me aware of is that I need to keep an eye open for the day when new exciting things stop happening. And possibly when the money tails off, because government funds in this country are very much under pressure. There's always worry about cuts in the agricultural budget. We've just survived, thankfully, another budget decision yesterday, which means that it's held up quite well. But when that gives up, the question will then be, is there enough private finance in the game for people to continue to want to carry on? And that is very much a question that's up for grabs at the moment. I and others are in lots of discussions with big corporates, pension funds, etc., about investing in these projects. But if that investment doesn't come before the government money starts to tail off, then that will be the true test of these individual private landowners' appetite and motivation. But coming back to that original point, and I'll finish with this, I still firmly believe that all of them are driven by the right motivations. They are driven to want to leave their land in a better condition for future generations for all the right reasons. And they are lucky, because they're fairly wealthy, that they can manage to do that, even though it might necessarily not be a major source of income. It is, a source of income for many, but it's not their only source of income, and therefore they can afford to be taking that approach. So I'll stop there, Alastair, but those are my initial thoughts.
That's wonderful, Alastair, and thanks so much for that. I suspect you're being modest about your own role in going out and visiting these landowners and adopting an approach that recognizes their autonomy and has, to use the sort of theoretical word, has an element of relatedness in it, that they could relate to you and that you related to them. and you didn't try to push them around and so on. So you've clearly done so much of this and developed a good skill around this, very high level of skill. So in a future round, I'd love to sort of hear a little bit more about that sort of relatedness part of it. Now, we are 9 minutes from the hour, but we are having such a good discussion. I think May and I have taken an executive decision to sort of go over the hour, and Rachel has very kindly said that she can stay awake a little bit longer. I hope that's all right with the other panelists. This is recorded. Anybody who wants to leave is free to leave, of course. But it's such a rich discussion, and we've got this unique opportunity with these amazing people here. So I'm going to come to you next, Jennifer, a bit of responding to the responders, really. But in a future round, I'd love to hear a little bit more about this relatedness aspect, this relationship aspect of rewilding and your experiences of this. And of course, we're going to start taking questions from participants as well. In the relatedness bit, I love this phrase from you, Daniel, this soft boundaries of tolerance. I can think of quite a few people in my life and out there in the world who could do with some soft boundaries of tolerance. I think the world could take a lot better if there was a bit of that. But anyway, to you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Well, such great comments all around here. So I think a common thread that ran through all of those was financial incentives or compensation. And that's a really important thing for us to talk about in this context. Because, of course, just because a landowner is intrinsically motivated, it's not a given that they have the resources to put their plan into place. And it may be an important part of our role. It's often an important part of our role to provide those resources, whether that's in terms of paying for it, or maybe those resources in terms of expertise. So I think the things that were talked about here make a whole lot of sense. Having an ongoing incentive program that is durable, that definitely helps take the risk away from the situation, as Rachel talked about. And Danny talked about right sizing that payment, not making it so big that it's dangling a carrot out here, but rather something that feels like we're compensating this private landowner for this public good, and maybe not enough to really shift a whole lot of behavior and resources in a direction where there would be a risk of it shifting backwards after. One of the really important things with financial incentives, because I should reiterate, I'm not opposed to financial incentives in any way. I think they're a critical tool for conservation. But one of the important things in it is how we communicate them. If it is transactional, like you do this, I give you that, I think that's where you get into the risk of it really, of that over-justification effect and seeing behavior retract after the incentive is removed. But there are ways that we can talk about the financial assistance, or even providing expertise under that competence side of things, that would not undermine intrinsic motivation. So if instead of saying, I will pay you to do this, it might be something more like, I see this is really important to you and you want to do this. Can I help you implement your vision? That kind of communication, that's really you're making a relationship with them. You're letting, you're putting a spotlight on the motivation they already have and their goals. You're emphasizing potentially alignment with their values. I really thought what Danny said about connecting with heritage and cowboy culture was really interesting. Identity is really durable. It's even more durable than intrinsic motivation if you can really tap into that identity. So that's important. And then the last thing I'd like to say is that if you remember that chart of different gradations of extrinsic motivation that I put up, the extrinsic motivation 101 of that is that along that gradation, you might place different interventions. So you might have fines at the really external end, and then the social networking effects in the middle, and then something more like job creation programs, or things that are really valuable to communities on the more intrinsic side of things, or internalized side of things. The next level of that conversation is that with any different type of intervention, so even like within financial incentive programs, you can still have that gradation of how external or how internal they feel. So you can imagine a financial incentive that feels very, very external. I mean, especially a fine, right? That's kind of the most external thing you can get, that kind of punishment. But you can also create a financial incentive program with the right kind of language. We're responding to your need. You've expressed this need for financial assistance. We're going to help you get that. You had a need for some expertise on identifying which part of the land is most important. We can help you with that. So that kind of the way that it's communicated, I think, is really critical. And then to kick off the conversation about relatedness, so relatedness, that's saying what we're doing here connects me to something bigger than myself. I mean, what better describes rewilding, right? I think it's such an optimistic vision, and it explains one of the really great benefits of groups like the Global Rewilding Alliance, who keeps rewilding hopeful, it keeps it positive, and bringing together so many people all around the world doing these fantastic things. That's that feeling of connection that ties us all together.
That's wonderful, Jennifer. Thank you. So on this question of relatedness, I'd like to get a view from each of the four of you on this relatedness. And I've written down three components of the relatedness, which won't be exhaustive, but how you develop relationships with landowners, how you talk to them, and how you connect them to each other around nature recovery and rewilding. So there may be sort of elements of each of those that you're doing, which over time can build up and deepen those relationships. I'm glad you mentioned job creation, Jennifer. I have two things to say on that. One is, Alastair has amazing evidence on this across UK showing that when land is rewilded, the amount of jobs on that land more than doubles. And so in many ways, rewilding is the opposite of pushing people off the land. It's repeopling. Repeopling the landscape is a big part of rewilding, giving new livelihoods in areas that otherwise are typically losing people to the cities and so on. There's a huge kind of exodus from the countryside in many parts of the world. And this thing about getting under the skin of communities, of course, many of you live in the landscapes that you're helping to rewild. And I was talking to a woman called Andrea Powell, who set up an amazing rewilding project in Namibia last week. She was in London. And she said that their organization has employed one of the local farmers' sons to do the outreach to the farmers, to the landowners. And this is very canny because, he's part of that community. He understands that lifestyle. He understands them. He knows a lot of them. And this slow process of sort of embedding the identity of that local rewilding project is helped, I guess, by having a local person like that being very involved in it. So let's go in reverse order this time. Alastair, to you, some thoughts about the relatedness aspect of this.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on the developing relationships and connecting people up, because that's what I try to do whenever I'm visiting or revisiting rewilding sites. And again, I'd like to cite this particular example. It's typical of the sorts of things that are happening across the country. So here at this Broughton Sanctuary, we have embarked on a dedicated program of community engagement for the project. Now, when these projects start, of course, these private projects, the landowner can pretty much, as long as he gets the right permissions and consents from the statutory authorities, he can pretty much do what he wants to do within his or her own land boundary. But there are plenty of examples where landowners are going that extra mile to communicate and engage with the local community. And this is a good one in question, because they've created, for example, a 30-kilometre long permissive footpath that weaves its way through the site, linking in with public footpaths, but providing access to the land, which was never available before at a very significant scale. And now we're producing information to help educate people as they walk that path and learn more about the history and the culture and what wildlife they're going to see. They've set themselves targets through partly linked to a funding mechanism, yes, but they've committed to 10,000 visitors a year coming to the site. And gradually, that the awareness of this site is growing all the time. And it's been very interesting for me because just in the last couple of months, since I turned gone private, I've already had 2 approaches from landowners within a few miles of this site as a direct result of what's happening here, who now want to talk about the same sort of transition from intensive farming to much more nature-led land management. So if you're patient and you are open with what you do with the local community and you start to encourage people in, you often have to ride that initial skepticism and even antagonism to start with. But gradually people start looking over the fence and saying, actually, that's not so bad. Wolves aren't sweeping babies out of prams. They're actually, he seems to be doing very well. I've just seen him on the news again. National Geographic awarded this site as being on its top 30 sites to visit in the world on its cool list 2 years ago. So, once these things start happening, people look over the fence and say, oh, I think that could work for me. And that's what I'm seeing repeatedly around the country.
That's wonderful, Alastair. That reminds me of a story that Ben Goldsmith told me on his rewilding site in Somerset in the west of England, that the neighboring landowner breeds racehorses and was initially very skeptical about the reintroduction of beavers onto the land. But a couple of years later, was literally leaning over the fence. And bear in mind that this is a place where the upper reaches of the River Frome have been put into a tunnel, a 200-meter tunnel underneath this immaculate bit of grazed lawn for the racehorses. And the landowner is leaning over the fence saying to Ben, do you think we could maybe reinstate the riverbed and I could have your beavers to help me do it? So it's amazing, the initial skepticism just by witnessing the boom in nature and all of the wonderful birds and so on coming back on Ben's land led the initially skeptical landowner to lean over the fence and start proposing putting back in an entire bit of river that had been put into a culvert. So to you, Daniel.
Yeah, I guess unrelatedness. Well, first of all, I mean, I think to the point that Jennifer made, for American Prairie itself, for our staff, our supporters, our staff in particular, and I include myself in this, I think the existence of something like the Global Rewilding Alliance and the ability to collaborate with other rewilding projects internationally has been very, very helpful. I think if you just look within the state of Montana where we operate, you don't really find anything else that looks like American Prairie. And I think it can be kind of a lonely venture to think about doing rewilding, even zooming out to the United States or North America. Like there's just not actually GRA has actually shined a spotlight on a lot more like North American projects than I think we were aware of, which is helpful. But like also broadening that scope internationally, I think for our staff and our supporters, it's like, oh, no, this is not something that American Prairie like invented or is doing alone, but it is quite a bit of global community. It's very helpful, I think, for the motivation of the people that work at American Prairie, like our staff, our supporters, our donors, our board members, et cetera. Relatedness, I think, is a little bit tricky when we think about like our neighbors, right? The people that we're attempting to work with when it comes to things like wild sky. Because I think the narrative is sculpted in such a way that like there is a relatedness pressure and it works against us currently. The relatedness is the community of rural Montana, and I think the pull to conform, it's an ugly word. I don't want to accuse somebody of that. The pull to the kind of what is defined as the traditional identity of the region is against things like conservation, restoration, ecology, these ideas of rewilding, certainly, right? And I think there's a very strong pull the other direction. This is why I think these ideas and what we've moved towards more recently is this idea of culture. In fact, if you look at most of our wild sky participants, the people who we've worked most successfully with for the longest time tend to actually be something of maybe outliers. They are very independently minded people that are much more willing to say, I don't really care what my neighbors think about this. This is good for me. This is good for my business. This is management that's in line with what my grandfather intended or what my grandmother had in mind when she immigrated to the region in the first place. And so it's the opposite of related. And it's just a willingness to say, like, I'm willing to work with these folks because I have a different goal in mind, not because I necessarily support American Prairie, but because they're willing to support these ideas I have, even if my neighbors think they're funny or crazy. To Alastair's point, I think over time you do get this looking over the fence idea where people go, hey, that actually kind of makes sense. You know what I mean? These conservation practices, whether it's, beaver mimicry and riparian restoration, like these things are good for ranching and these practices make sense. But this is what I guess I meant earlier when I talked about kind of cultural identity. I think to get to this idea of relatedness, at least for us in our context, it's less of I don't know if it's possible to turn somebody with an agricultural production mindset and value into a conservationist the way that we may all self-identify as, regardless of whether or not it's possible. I'm not sure it's our job necessarily. What I think is more productive and maybe works better, seems to be working better. And again, I think that you can find examples internationally where people are doing this very, very effectively, is this idea of connecting things to culture. Basically, like, this is not a new idea. I'm not selling you the idea of conservation or rewilding. I'm simply maybe trying to shine a light on the fact that, like, your forebearers, your grandfather, your great grandparents, or somebody that immigrated to the region, came to this region and settled and decided to stay for love of the region. It's connecting to pride in place. And I would suggest humbly that part of that pride in place that many of these ranching families have intrinsically at their core has to do with the wildness of the landscape, which unfortunately has been degraded around them for generations now. But rewilding is a message of hope and the idea that we can bring that back. And I think to the extent that you can connect that to their values, their cultures, their communities, and show the fact that, like, yeah, that Charlie Russell painting that you have above your fireplace that shows a very wild landscape with indigenous peoples in it and bison herds in it and cowboys in it is the kind of thing that we are seeking to bring back through our rewilding practices. So we're not asking you to subscribe to this idea of rewilding per se, but maybe just the idea that the culture that you already subscribe to is one that is largely based on wildness, even if that's not necessarily the thing that we usually talk about when we talk about that.
That's amazing, Daniel. And thank you so much for the lovely things that both you and Jennifer have said about the Alliance. We didn't come here digging for compliments, but since you've offered them, we accept them gladly. Sometimes it can feel like we're behind the scenes doing quite abstract stuff. And so it's really lovely to hear that you value the role. Just very interesting, this thing you said about independence. The people who are looking over the fence and working with you, Daniel, are bucking the trend in a sense of saying, well, I don't really mind what the other people think of me. And if I think of the typical, cowboy or cowgirl in the movies that I grew up watching, what was the one characteristic of them? It was like their independence, their willingness to stand on their own feet and go off. And this translates almost exactly to Jennifer's autonomy, I guess. And so it's almost like them being independent and autonomous, they are expressing their wildness in a funny sort of way because they're untrammeled by cultural expectations. So just sort of playing with some ideas there. Anyway, over to you, Rachel.
I'm tempted to give another example around farming, but I think I won't, because I suspect this will probably be the last case study I give, and I really want to touch on First Nations engagement and relatedness there. In Australia, around close to 50% of our landscapes now have native title overlay on them, and increasingly more and more land is being owned by Indigenous Australians under Indigenous protected areas. And too often, I think in the past, based on what I hear from traditional custodians, they feel as though, young ecologists fresh out of uni have come and offered partnership opportunities, and really, we were encouraged before to think about collaboration, not correction. I think one of the first ways to get the relatedness working well is listening. At Bush Heritage, we have 193 staff, and we put every single staff member through cultural competency training. Because if we can't approach a partnership with First Nations people, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, at least understanding that they have 65,000 years of cultural knowledge handed down from generation to generation of land management that we can learn from and we can benefit from before we start pushing our peer-reviewed science towards the partnership, then we're probably not going to get an enduring outcome. But the partnerships that are really strong that I've seen in my time here at Bush Heritage, and there's one on Jarrah country in Victoria in the Karakara Wedderburn. It's ancient woodlands. It took 4 years to write a co-designed land management plan called Warwick Gold Canoe. It might seem like a really long time, and it was from sitting under trees and yarning and working at the pace of traditional custodian group that we're working with, Jarrah. But that will be an enduring plan now, and it's been developed through right way science because it's a combination of that old world wisdom and that new world peer-reviewed science coming together and merging. And I think that when you get that right, you start to build that relatedness because you're listening to one another and you start to find those shared values and that common ground. And that's another example that's online if people want to look at the Warwick Gold Canoe example. But I think we have pastoralist partnerships, we have Aboriginal partnerships. When it comes to relatedness, we have to take very different approaches. I don't think a pastoralist partnership is going to want to spend 4 years working on just developing the plan together. And so we've got to understand, again, their purpose, their motivation, and work to their timelines, speak their language. But I did want to put that First Nations case in there because I think it's incredibly important and something I'd love to see our sector globally continue to work on and share.
That's wonderful, Rachel, and it's absolutely right that you put that in. We notice among our 250 plus alliance partners, so many organizations working with First Nations, working with local communities, Indigenous communities, learning from the errors of the last 100 years in development assistance that you cannot parachute in from outside and impose some kind of external solution and expect it to endure. That lesson has been well learned, and I feel that rewilding itself grew up as a movement at a moment when that lesson had been learned. And so that's sort of hard baked into the wisdom and modus operandi of the great majority of rewilding organizations that we see. But it's wonderful to hear how you're doing this. And the 4 years, that reminds me of a phrase, which is, most people overestimate what they can achieve in the short run, but they underestimate what they can achieve in the long run. And in my experience, a lot of big change comes about over the course of about 6 or 7 years. It takes that kind of length of time for it to mature and relationships to build up and momentum and so on. So very interesting to hear about your 4 years. I'd be very interested to hear where it is in 3 more years. So we have a question in from Adriana Brosmanova, who I remember is from Mossy Earth, I think. A wonderful organization, getting lots of people involved in rewilding. First of all, thank you for the very insightful and relevant presentation. Thanks, Adriana. What is your opinion on how the introduction of biodiversity credits might influence rewilding on private lands, and how best to consider the insights from behavioral psychology you talked about in the design of any payments for nature? I mean, that's a massive question, but to you first, Jennifer, you have spoken a little bit about this, about the design of payment schemes, but would you like to say a little bit more?
Sure, yeah. I think biodiversity credits would function in this sense very much like other financial incentives. And so it comes back to the question. So I don't think the question is biodiversity credits, yes or no. I think it's more how are biodiversity credits implemented. If they are created as a program that comes in response to what we know is a demonstrated need for more resources in the world of conservation and restoration and rewilding, absolutely, it makes a lot of sense. But if we are dangling our biodiversity credit money out there as a shiny thing that we want people to come chase, I think, again, we have that risk of undermining intrinsic motivation if it's there, or creating the type of extrinsic motivation that's not very durable.
Yeah, wonderful. So I'm going to introduce another question before going to the other panelists from, I think it's Amy from the World Foundation. Wonderful question here. 100% believe in the power of identity. And I also know that sometimes people aren't fully self-aware that they aren't living their identity.
Mm.
So this is an interesting mind bender. What are some strategies to wake people up to the identity that they subscribe to, but don't always embody? So this is, my way of expressing this would be like, sometimes most of us get bent out of shape by prevailing trends in culture and the people around us and so on. We don't fully live our values. But, Amy expresses it beautifully here about being fully self-aware about not living your identity. How can we help people to do that? Landowners in particular, of course. Who'd like to go? Just very brief answers now as we move towards the end.
I can give a quick answer to start.
Well, yes, great.
Yeah. So not a very practical response, but one way that psychology experiments show us that gets people to operate more consistently with their values is literal mirrors, which is one of the reasons you'll see mirrors on an ATM, a cash machine, or you'll see them in other places where people need to have more honest behavior. But in a more practical sense for us as conservationists and people working with private landowners, I think one is that if we're not perceived as part of the in-group, we are not the right person to shine a mirror on someone else not living with what we perceive as their identity or as their values. The messenger is really, really critical in terms of the messaging plan, right? And I think this comes back to other topics that have come up here before. I love the anecdote about the farmer's son being hired as a person employed in outreach, because there's nothing like a message from a person who is within one's own in-group. I think polarization in our world right now is so strong, and sometimes I regret that conservation, environmentalism, these things have come to be associated with one side of that polarization. It's in all of our best interest to depolarize that and make the way we talk about things really resonate with the values, not just of liberals, but of conservatives, of independents, of people of any political persuasion. Because whenever there is a group division, there will be a response against it. There is some really interesting research about changing the identity of farmers. It's been a little while since I've read it, and I can't cite the papers off the top of my head, but there's some interesting work that was done around changing what's included in a good farmer identity. And in the study I'm thinking of right now, the thing that was of interest was what a good farm looks like. Farmers often will want to keep land tidier than conservationists would like the land to be. It needs to be a little bit messy in order to create a lot of different heterogeneity in the habitats there. And so working on not trying to change at the behavioral level, but trying to communicate using a partner from within that group to redefine the identity, that's something that is maybe a place to start.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I'm struggling now to keep up with the chat in the chat and all of the questions coming through. I'm going to limit us to 10 more minutes because then that's 90 minutes. And after 90 minutes, you need to stand up and move and walk and so on. And otherwise, you're going to get stressed and heart attacks and so on. And well-being is important, especially in this movement, because otherwise we burn out. So Alastair, to you on that last question.
Well, I think one obvious way is to do what you're doing at the GRA, Alastair, and indeed what I helped to initiate in this country with establishing a rewilding network, because bringing people together to feel like they're part of a movement and enabling that process to remind people of the key principles and priorities for rewilding is very, very important. Rewilding is a very specific form of conservation. It has clear definition through the IUCN and set of principles. And just recently, I've edited the guidelines, which are due to be published soon. And it is very important that we remind newcomers to the movement that these principles apply. And I think that is definitely helping to keep us all on the same track. There are now major events. Last week it was a big rewilding event in Somerset where over 100 people came. Last autumn we had a huge event in Cambridge, which was attended by over 400 people, a conference specifically dedicated to rewilding, hearing stories from across the country and indeed from other countries. I think, it's a bit like me. It's almost full circle for me. I was doing this for river restoration in the 80s and 90s, and I've seen exactly the same pattern of engagement and growth, where initially you're mocked and ridiculed, and then gradually people come on board and start speaking with one voice. So I think that's a crucial part of the movement forward.
Wonderful. Before I bring in Daniel or Rachel, I just want to read a beautiful text that's been sent in from Johanna Nielsen from Wild Sami in Sweden. I'm Johanna Nielsen, Wild Foundation Sami, a Sami-led initiative addressing the critical challenges of deforestation, ecological degradation, and cultural preservation through sustainable solutions rooted in traditional knowledge. I also want to thank you to Rachel and Alastair for highlighting the kinship and the intrinsic motivation for Indigenous people. Here in Sami, Sweden, we, the Sami people, have a strong intrinsic motivation to protect and restore ecosystems because our identities, culture, and way of life are deeply interwoven with the lands we inhabit. It's a deep sense of responsibility and a sacred duty passed down through generations. Now, that's really beautiful. And just imagine if more of us got up every day feeling that in our hearts. And to me, that I think is this visceral thing that millions of people are now responding to around the world. Just in the last week, just in the last few days, we've talked to new organizations in Sierra Leone, Namibia, as I said, Mexico, Korea. The first author of a book about rewilding in Korean coming out next month. So, it's extraordinary what's happening around the world, this burgeoning movement, people responding to the same kinds of thing that Johanna talks about in this beautiful message. We are moving towards the end. A couple of final, very brief thoughts, maybe a minute each from each of the panelists. Daniel, would you like to go first? Put you on the spot.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about the question about people not realizing their intrinsic motivations. And I would I think, echo what Jennifer said, which is I think the messenger is very important here. Roderick Nash, in his book Wilderness in the American Mind, has this excellent line that I'll paraphrase, which is just to say you can't make a New Yorker care about the conservation of yellow taxis. It's a bit of a dated example nowadays with the advent of Uber and stuff like that. But I think it's true that conservation is something that kind of you can only be seen from a distance. It's really hard to get people that live amongst something to recognize it as something to be conserved if it's quite literally the habitat, the environment that they live in. We've done a little bit more work. I grew up in Washington, D.C. No rancher in Montana wants to hear my ideas about conservation, and it's certainly not my job to suggest that they might not be getting closer to their intrinsic motivations. We hired a woman that took over the Wild Sky program from me. She's from North Dakota, a whole lot better. We just hired a woman that's doing the field work now that came from the local region. These things I think will make a difference over time. But just as to highlight, I think what the difference that I've seen on the ground is that, if you listen to the concerns of the people in the region, they're not lamenting the loss of wildlife. And so I think it's a bit of a disconnect to come in and say that, like, what we really want you to care about is the rewilding of wolves or grizzly bears or beaver or prairie dogs or long-billed curlews or bison or whatever. If you ask them what their concerns are, it is that their way of life is somehow disappearing, and that organizations like American Prairie pose some kind of existential threat to that. Now, I don't believe that. I don't think that is true. But their concerns are there's not enough tax base for their kids to be able to go to rural school. They're going to have to bus them an hour to go find a school to go to. There is no ranch for their kids to inherit, and therefore they will not be able to grow up the way that they grew up. The way of life that they knew and love and have persisted in living despite it not really being that lucrative is disappearing, and those options are not available for their children. Now, I would say, as a conservationist, that the messages from ecology are that diversity breeds resilience. That's true in ecology, that's true in economics, and I would say that's true in sociology as well. But far be it from me as some kind of academic to come in and tell people that that's what's going on. I think rewilding is a solution to those concerns, but the messenger is critically important because frankly, it can't come from somebody that looks like me. It has to come from somebody that looks like a rancher and can speak about the municipal water source and the volunteer fire department, not grizzly bears and prairie dogs.
Wonderful. Thank you, Daniel. Always so clear. Rachel.
Yeah, well, in my conclusion, I might just quickly try to answer that last question as well by saying I recall when I was studying conservation psychology, two social scientists that addressed that question, Wesley Schultz and Doug Mackenzie Moore, I believe. So if the person asking that wants to have a look at their papers, they try to encourage us in the environmental movement to challenge the question a little and break down the assumption that because people have strong beliefs and strong attitudes, and therefore that informs their identity, they're naturally going to behave accordingly, and that there are so many other factors that influence our behaviors. And marketeers are so good at getting us to do things that actually are outside of our identity, buying things we don't need because they understand those motivators, and they really encourage our sectors, so community-based social marketing, those sorts of tools. So have a look at their work if that helps. Not that I claim to have all the answers, but they've helped me from time to time as well. And then I would close by saying we are a social species, and I think the reason I would draw attention to their work, and it's a lot of what Jennifer's doing today, is thinking about what makes us tick. And as a species ourselves, we like to be part of something. We like to be connected. We're not meant to be solitary and alone. And I wanted to say thank you all for the invitation to be here today, to be part of this global community that's doing incredible things and learning together and sharing ideas. And, I say let's keep the conversation going, because there's never been a more important time to protect healthy country. And it's wonderful to be a part of this global community. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's epic what you're doing. There's no other word for it, and an incredible sign of your commitment being here at it must be close to 2 a.m. in the middle of the night. Thank you so much, Alastair. Final word, brief word.
Yeah, very briefly. Bearing in mind the title, Engaging Landowners in Rewilding, I think I want to emphasize two specific things. First of all, hope. All these projects that we are talking about, all this body of work that we're involved in across the world is bringing hope for the future. Yes, we have to very briefly remind people of the dire situation we're in, but we have to quickly move on to talk about all the amazing positive stories coming out from the projects that we've heard about today and more besides. And then the second word is inspiration. And to do that, we need to take more people, particularly politicians and influencers, to see these places. We need to get them out in these places to inspire them to do more in their daily life to make more of this amazing, hopeful work happen.
That's brilliant. Penultimate word to you, Jennifer, and then I'll just very quickly wrap up.
Yes, I just wanted to add here, I think that it's important to know that self-determination theory can apply at different scales. It's not just with individuals, it also applies to communities. And it's also been shown to improve not only engagement, but actual on-the-ground conservation outcomes. There was a systematic review in conservation biology back around 2019, looking at the engagement of communities that were cited on the periphery of protected areas. And what they found was that the more autonomy those communities had in how they engage with the protected area and in doing protected area peripheral conservation, the more engaged the people were, and the more engaged they were, the better the conservation outcomes on their land. So I'll leave it with that.
That's absolutely wonderful. Well, this has been just fantastic. An absolutely brilliant example of the degree of confidence that comes from the last 30, 35 years of the growth of the global rewilding movement. We now have incredible credibility that comes from all of this work, working at increasing scale, as we've heard from the likes of Daniel and Rachel and Alastair, in different locations, incredible amounts of land being put into rewilding. We think that we're at stage 3 of 5 in the growth of the movement, and we're calling this preparing for scaling. And stage 4 is going to be this sort of hockey stick bit, the vertical bit of the growth of the global movement, which is the actual sort of exponential phase. And so all of this that we're doing now is preparing for this next exponential phase in the movement, where we 10 times the amount of land and oceans under rewilding. And I truly believe that is possible, given the credibility demonstrated by the kinds of organizations represented here today. To get there, we need private landowners, we need private resources. As Rachel said, it's unrealistic to think that this is all going to happen through governments or philanthropy. So, this topic of how to work with private landowners on rewilding is just central to that exponential enabling. And we're all part of something bigger than ourselves. This is something that several of you have said, and it's what I call an inspiring shared purpose beyond self. And I truly believe that, this is the thing that really motivates humans at their best and can drive us beyond any sort of short-term fears and so on, lacks of resources. This is why, the movement is growing so rapidly. And I'm going to reflect further on these 3 things of autonomy, competence, and relatedness in how we build the global rewilding movement. The Alliance is now over 250 organizations operating in 125 countries. Please, if you're not yet following us or engaged, or if you'd like your organization to join, please be in touch with us. We'd be absolutely delighted to have you involved. There are amazing things happening. People are starting to think about setting up Rewilding Colombia and Rewilding India, Rewilding Canada, and we are here to help. So please follow us on the socials, Global Rewilding Alliance on Instagram, on LinkedIn. We're rapidly growing. And the recording of this webinar will be posted to our YouTube channel. So it'll be there in perpetuity, that you can go back and listen again, as I will, to the wisdom of all the panelists, because there was so much content. So thank you all for being here. It's been really wonderful. All the best.